Hello, everyone. Welcome back to St. Louis Teens. And today we have Arvin Vohra, who is the founder of the Vohra Method and the former vice chairman of the Libertarian National Committee and a candidate for the U.S. Senate in 2018 in Maryland. More recently, Arvin, you ran for nomination for the presidency
hmm
of the Libertarian Party, and you're a proponent of the anarcho-capitalism political philosophy and economic theory that advocates the elimination of centralized states in favor of self-ownership, private property, and free markets. So,
hmm
thank you so much for being here with us today.
Oh, thanks for having me on. Appreciate that.
Arvin, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what inspired you to go into politics and public service, and how has your journey been like?
Sure. So as you know, my background is in education. And when you work in education, you really see the damage that the state is doing. You see the way that it damages kids' education, their self-confidence, but more importantly, you see the way that it damages parents control their kids' education. You know, we talk to so many parents who feel powerless because they're faced with a monolithic state that's going to make them teach their kids or make their kids learn in ways that don't work for their own kids and do all this kind of damage. So when you see it so close, so personal, it really changes the way you look at it. And the idea at that point of sitting on the sidelines and saying, yeah, I guess it's not that bad, that's not really an option anymore when it's people who you know, people who you work with, people who you're trying to see make something better with their lives.
And throughout your journey in the political landscape, I know it can be difficult, but what would you say is your favorite part of, the entire political sphere?
The really great thing about politics is you see people actually taking control over their own lives. So often we are trapped in this belief that there's nothing you can do, that this is just how things are and there's nothing you can do about it. It's just how it's going to be. But when you start to get involved in politics, you start to realize two things. One is that you actually do have much more influence than you think you do. And the second thing is when you start to study it, you start to notice how small areas, small changes can have a really big impact. And so those are the two things that are really what I find to be most exciting about politics.
And one of the most revolutionary policies that you talk about is eliminating the income tax
hmm
altogether. So, first off, how did you come across this idea? And, as a second part, people who are opposed to this may question where government funding would be coming from. So, could
Sure.
you sort of respond to both these?
Sure. So the first part of it is somebody told me something that I found just shocking, which was that by cutting government spending to 1992 levels, we could end the income tax. Now, I was alive in 1992. We had roads and we had all. It was a modern society. We weren't riding around on horses or anything like that. And was shocked at that. So I went and I verified it myself. My background, by the way, is before I did politics or education, I was an actuary, so I have some facility with that. And that was overestimating. You could actually cut it to even less than that. You could just go to 1998 levels. But just 19, let's say we go conservative. We say 1992 levels. We could get government spending to that level and have no income tax at all. Are you kidding me? I couldn't believe that. And so when I realized that through honestly relatively modest changes, we could get rid of the most hated part of government, that I was sold.
Being public.
Actually, I forgot to answer the second half of your
Yeah,
question,
yeah,
which is where would the funding come from, right?
yeah.
And so in a lot of areas, a lot of areas, if it depends on who you ask, right? If you ask me, I'd say, well, a lot of it just wouldn't. There's a lot of areas that I don't think that anyone should do, government or anybody else. As you probably know, I'm a huge proponent of ending the drug war. I don't think that locking somebody in jail for a physical disease is the right thing to do. It's not practical. It doesn't even work. There's drugs in prison, and that's how ineffective it is. So there's certain things that I just say no one should do ever. No one should go around. One of the things that we do with our tax money is often end up arming and funding both sides of the same civil war. So in Syria, for example, the US government funded one side through the Pentagon, the other side through the Department of Defense. Again, that's something that no one should be doing. Nobody should take a war and make it worse. So there's a lot of things that simply should not be done, period. There are other things that can be done more cheaply by the private sector. Uh, Healthcare is a big one. If you look at the amount of cost added by the FDA's approval process, you start to see that it's basically creating a situation that hurts people. If you have a rare disease, you're never, ever, 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 ever going to see a cure because there's no way for drug companies to recoup the profits of the huge approval costs. Uh, a lot of times the cures exist. They just don't go through the final phase of trials. So one thing, there's things that I think no one should do. Other things I think can be done much more effectively privately. And so the combination of don't do it at all and do it voluntarily are the two solutions, the two replacements I would have for any kind of taxing. Now, if you just want to keep government basically functioning as it is, but a little bit less, you can cut the income tax and still do that. I would take it further.
Another one of those revolutionary policies that you often talk about is, eliminating public schools and the Department of Education.
Mm-hmm.
And in that scenario, first off, what would be the best alternative to educate kids? And how would this affect education workers?
So for the first question, I mean, I've been working in education for a long time, and there isn't one. There's not one way to educate everybody. That way doesn't exist. People complain about Common Core, and I agree that Common Core is a very, very bad way to teach 99% of kids. But my guess is it's probably a great way to teach maybe 0.5% of kids, and that's fine. I think 0.5% of kids, which is thousands, millions of people, fine. Let that 0.5% of kids buy the Common Core books and use them. The idea of a free market is not that there's a one monolithic solution. We should have as many choices in education as we have in restaurants. We should have more choices in education than in a restaurant because honestly, education is more important than eating out. So there's not one way to do it, but rather multiple ways to do it. Some of the ways that exist right now that are free, you have Khan Academy, you have MIT's OpenCourseware, you have edX, you have Yale OpenCourse. There's so many free alternatives right now to learn things. There's many low-cost alternative ways to prove that you know things, right? So one of the programs that my campaign staff and also people at Board Method worked on, something called the AP Homeschool Project, which literally is a guide on how, without public schools or private schools or charter schools, how you can give yourself an education better than anything there at all. So there are already alternatives, but the idea is there will be more alternatives as people turn more to the voluntary marketplace.
And how would this change affect the education workers who are working in this sector?
Positively for the most part. I mean, I'm an education worker that happens to work in the current equivalent of that sector. And it's fantastic. I mean, it's the best job in the whole world. And I want more people to have that type of job. I talk to a lot of public school teachers. I talk to a lot of private school teachers. And I talk to people who have so many ideas, so many clever, innovative, brilliant ways of educating that they legally can't use. Sometimes I just borrow those ideas. We make them part of our method, but sometimes they don't really fit into our model. So you have these incredible ideas. They're just going to waste. I want educators to be able to take those amazing ideas that they already have. They already have the ideas. I've talked to them about the ideas. They're great ideas, and be able to use them and say, listen, I'm offering a program that if you have a student that's really interested in this and this and this, come to my program. So I think it gives educators, just as it gives parents and students more choices, it gives educators more choices.
And, continuing that to, in your opinion, what are some of the current strengths of our country? It can be beyond education,
Sure.
but our country as a whole, what are some of the strengths that you would like to grow?
The American culture, the American people, the spirit of the American people is the most innovative spirit anywhere. At any point in human history, in any part of the world, this is the most innovative, most adaptable, most resilient culture I've ever seen, ever studied. And I've traveled all over the world. I've never seen anything that comes even slightly close to this. And the strength of us, our strength, that innovative strength, is what has always solved the problems that we face. And the problems that we have yet to solve are usually only still problems because we have not been able to allow that kind of innovation there. Innovation has artificially been removed from education. It's not that we're not innovative, it's we can't be. Where you let innovation exist, the results are incredible. Where you prevent it, the results are disastrous. And so to me, the greatest thing about America is that spirit of innovation.
And talking about that spirit of innovation, I think, with the new generation, how do you think that teenagers and, the people who are going into college and people who are, going into high school now can be instrumental in bringing change that is meaningful to their futures?
Teenagers have a lot more power than they realize. People often fixate on the fact that you can't, that teenagers by and large can vote. I mean, if you're 18 or 19, you can, but the rest of the time you can't. And that's true. And honestly, I don't think that's right. If you're, 15, 16, you have a job, you're paying taxes, you're paying sales tax, you're paying income taxes. By what right does somebody tell you you have no say over how the money that you are being forced to pay, how that's spent? You're 15, you're 16, you can, you're 18, you can be the idea that when you're 15, you can't fight against a war that you might be drafted into is absurd. And I think that's completely wrong. The good news is that teenagers just can have a lot of influence. In the Libertarian Party, our Instagram account is entirely run by teenagers. Too young to vote, but not too young to influence policy. In our social media pages, Facebook, we had so many teenage volunteers that had a big say in how, I mean, if you're involved, if you're a political volunteer, you work hard, you end up having a much bigger say than you would ever imagine that you would have. So I would say that if you're a teenager and you want to have that kind of influence in the world, recognize that voting is the just one tiny piece of it. You can fundraise, you can work on social media, you can work in traditional media, you can be a surrogate speaker, you can go door to door. I mean, there's so many things that you can do to make your voice heard, even if you can't vote.
Arvin, first off, just thank you so much for educating us on these perspectives. I think that no matter what your perspective is or where your political beliefs lie, it's always important to learn more about different perspectives and educate yourself on the other beliefs that are present within our nation. And thank you so much for your time today and answering all of our questions.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.